Anna Kasparian from TYT, executive producer and host. Thank you very much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Really, really appreciate it. What do you attribute like the massive misdiagnosis of what was going to happen or what was likely to happen here?
So, look, I don't begrudge anyone for getting the very beginning wrong, right? For not agreeing or not thinking that Russia was going to do what it ended up doing. Even individuals who took those threats seriously didn't expect the nature in which Putin has done this invasion. Right. I don't think they expected it to be as widespread and as aggressive and indiscriminate in terms of the strikes. Like, I don't think anyone really expected that. But I do think that there are people who I think they're trying to figure out, all right, I have chosen a very specific ideology for myself. And so they've turned to various figures to just go along with what they say the left should believe. How should the left think about this? Mm-hmm. And I don't know, most of the conversations that I've heard from the left have bothered me and have, look, here's where I stand. I think it's important to state where I stand. I don't think we should implement a no-fly zone. A no-fly zone would escalate the war. It's a terrible, terrible idea. I do not have a problem with arming the Ukrainians. A portion of the left, I think, is under the assumption that, well, not under the assumption, they think it's a terrible idea. We shouldn't support that because they're worried about the weapons ending up in the wrong hands. And to be sure, you know, there are some pretty terrible people, like the Azov battalion's been getting a lot more attention, I think, disproportionate attention. They absolutely despise Vladimir Zelensky. And so the idea is, all right, well, we're pumping weapons into this country. There are all sorts of shady figures that we're not in favor of. So, okay, so what's the answer? Because they're leaving important context out of it, which is we got Ukraine to agree to give up their nuclear arsenal. Mm-hmm. And in return, the United States offered security guarantees. So if we just abandon Ukraine after we made this agreement with them, what does that signal to the rest of the world? What does that signal to other nuclear powers that we might want to negotiate with in the future in this quest of nuclear disarmament? Because that should still be a goal, right?
Right.
Yeah. So it's way more complicated and nuanced. And I think the thing that really bothers me is you have a bunch of leftists, and there's different flavors of leftists online, right? Mm-hmm. The group I'm talking about are like the dudes who love to sit around and like have their circle jerk sessions on theory, but they don't like to actually talk about the consequences of making these international agreements and then completely abandoning them. Not a good sign. I mean, what we did in Iran under Trump was another terrible example where we have a nuclear agreement with Iran. Trump comes in and just totally rips it up. We don't have a really great track record on holding up our side of the deal. And let's get our noses out of the theory books for a second and actually look at real life and how we should apply those theories in a way that actually makes sense.
100% agreed. So because I've been noticing this too, right? There was a lot of pushback on the left in the months leading up to this conflict because, you know, oh, he's not going to do it. He's not going to do it. This is, this is all posturing. And this was happening while Russia was building like field hospitals and moving blood supplies to the front lines, which is not something you need to do if you're having just training exercises, generally speaking. Right. And even Ukrainians, like there were polls that came out like the day before or a couple days before the invasion began, like only 20% of Ukrainians thought that the invasion was actually going to happen. Very few people were taking this seriously, and a lot of people, even in Ukraine, were saying, you know, this is posturing by Joe Biden to make his presidency look stronger. And I mean, that is a lot of faith in Democrats to try and make themselves look stronger, I suppose. But this entire process has been really strange because I feel like, and maybe this is a particularly American point of view, I guess. I think that as Americans, we tend to be very domestically focused and not so much focused on foreign policy aspects.
Totally.
And this has been very frustrating because as like I do a daily show on Twitch and I interact a lot with my Twitch viewers, and a lot of people just don't understand geopolitics and like don't understand like the consequences of different political maneuvering on a geopolitical scale. And that to your point, like, you know, a lot of Republicans will rah about Trump pulling out of the Iranian agreement, but that undermines us geopolitically severely, because in geopolitics you want to be predictable. You don't want to just be shooting from the hip, as it were.
Yeah, well, you want to be reliable to your allies,
Right.
or you want to be reliable to nations that you have made an agreement with. And there were so many examples recently, not to pick on Trump. I know there's lots of Democratic presidents who have made terrible decisions as well, but these are fresh in my memory. You know, the fact that we worked alongside the Kurds in Syria to root out ISIS, and then Trump has a weekend phone call with Erdogan, the leader of Turkey, and the next day announces that U.S. troops will be pulling out of the portion of Syria where our Kurdish allies were, paving the way for Turkey to come in and slaughter them. I mean, the U.S. just does not have a good track record on foreign policy, does not have a good track record on keeping up with our promises or following through with them. Obviously, we talk about, you know, the various orchestrated coups in Latin American countries. We talk about what's happening in Yemen. So when it comes to intel that's being forced upon us by the State Department, I think that it is human nature, it's common sense to be skeptical of that intel. So for me, it wasn't, I think that there are two camps, right? And I fall in this one specific camp. One camp just like seems to be full of apologists for Putin. I don't understand it. I am not in any way delusional about who Putin really is. However, I fall in the camp of the U.S. has made up a lot of lies about Russia recently. And so what's going to, like, why would I believe this? So just last year or 2 years ago, there was this whole story about how Russia was paying the Taliban bounties for U.S. soldiers in Afghanistan. And it turned out like legacy media outlets had to retract that later. Okay. So, and then there was the whole thing with Russia meddling in our elections. I think that there was a kernel of truth to that, which is, of course, Russia was trying to meddle in our elections. But, you know, the way that it was being covered and the way the government, the State Department was talking about it was overblown. And when you keep crying wolf, well, you know what happens. Eventually people just stop believing you. So I fell in that camp. And then the other thing is, so I studied political science, and I got to be honest, I'm now questioning it, but I kind of fell in the camp of realist political theory, right? So I did believe Mearsheimer had the right theory on this, and he was my favorite political scientist when I was getting my master's degree in poli-sci. And so I turned to him, you know, and listened to what he had to say, and he had a lot of really great points about NATO and how the expansion eastward is very provocative for the Russians. They do see it as a security threat. And I thought that was legitimate. I genuinely did believe that, you know, if the US continues doing this, if the West continues doing this, they're the ones who are fueling a potential war, and it's unacceptable. And I still think that there are huge issues with NATO. With that said, though, Putin's invasion has nothing to do with NATO. And I think that's been clearer and clearer in recent days. He just gave another insane, unhinged speech, and he very clearly wants to rebuild the Russian Empire. It sounds insane and it sounds laughable, but it's just blood and soil over and over again.
Yeah, no, it is. From one of his very early speeches a couple weeks ago at the beginning of all of this, it was like very, very heavy on the blood and soil rhetoric. And I think that I think that we should take this as some kind of a warning sign. You know, this is, I think, one of the possible endpoints of allowing power and wealth to accumulate to a point where he's basically untouchable. He is possibly the richest individual on Earth. And, you know, for as many sanctions as we're throwing around, that's definitely going to affect his inner circle, but him personally, not so much. There's no way to rein in an individual who has amassed authoritarian power in their country and amassed so much wealth that they are practically untouchable.
Yeah, and look, I think it's also important to, I mean, look at both domestic politics and geopolitics through a materialist lens. And there's definitely, you know, Richard Wolff said something on his podcast recently that really clicked. He mentioned how this really is the evolution of capitalism, right? Because what we're seeing now is, like, we see the rise and fall of various hegemons, and what's behind it is usually material interests. And so we went from a multipolar world, you know, to with the United States being a unipolar world, just the United States being the leading superpower. And I think that it has been shifting in recent decades. You're seeing the emergence of China. I think that our adversarial relationship with Russia is helping to unify Russia and China. And so Russia's badly battered right now, but China, that is a tricky situation, right? I think right now the United States and the West is pretty terrified at the notion of China coming in to save the day for Russia, because China is an emerging superpower. A lot of countries, especially the United States, are very much dependent on China. And Xi Jinping is smart. I think he knows what he's doing here. I think he understands the fears that the United States and the West have. In the very beginning of this war, if you could notice, Germany was kind of trying to toe a line because they really wanted to go through with that, Russian gas pipeline, the Nord Stream 2. And then after the invasion happened, they freaked out, as they should, I think, and decided to go along with the Western alliance on this. I think that was the right move for them, but we'll see how it all plays out. I think that this situation, it doesn't just stop with Ukraine. Right. And I'm not like some warmonger who thinks, oh my God, Russia's going to attack all of these other countries next. I don't know. I mean, there's a possibility, but what I really think this is about at the end of the day is the growing influence of China. That's like that's in the backdrop. And I think that's something that's going to be more and more front and center in our consciousness as geopolitical news develops.
Yeah, you bring up a really interesting point with China because, Ukraine is not part of NATO. And if China got involved in Ukraine, which they could do, it would be very, very difficult, if not impossible, to hit them with the same kind of sanctions that Russia got hit with. The world global system would not be able to tolerate it the same way it can with Russia. And that is frankly the most realistic and terrifying possibility going forward when it comes to this. Yeah, it is. I mean, I don't know how this is all going to play out. I think, like most people, I try to grab onto the small kernels of positive news, although Putin's recent speech kind of squashed the most recent positive news story that I saw, which was that the peace talks they were having seemed to be finally going somewhere. It was the first time that they engaged in peace talks for 3 consecutive days. And then there were positive comments from both sides, both from the Russian officials who took part and also Zelensky himself. And it seemed like Putin was just trying to look for a way out, because right before the invasion happened, I think Zelensky and Olaf Scholz, the Chancellor of Germany, made it pretty clear that they were going to drop the idea of Ukraine joining NATO, at least for now. But Putin did the invasion anyway. Yeah. And so he knows that they dropped it, but he is now saying, or his officials are saying, well, you know, the talks are going somewhere. Ukraine has agreed to drop their bid to join NATO. And so it's like, sure, if that's what they want to do to make it appear as though Russia won something, great. Right.
Okay, as long as it ends the bloodshed. But Putin's speech today was really scary. He went after the West, but more importantly, he talked about purging his country of Russians who disagree with him, referred to them as scum. It was just disgusting.
Talking the framing over the last couple days has been any Russian trying to flee into Finland or any of the other Western countries is a traitor, and ramping up the rhetoric. I don't think at this point it is out of the question that we could see some sort of Russian purge, given what we're seeing from police response to people who are just stepping in front of cameras.
Yep.
There's the viral video of the two people going in front of the camera. One of them has a sign that just says 2 words, and the other one seems like she's going to be supportive of the invasion of Ukraine, and then gets arrested anyway before she can even say anything.
Yeah.
So I'm genuinely worried about the safety of people within Russia, especially the television producer who got arrested. She was held for questioning for 14 hours, denied counsel. Nobody knew where she was.
Yeah, terrifying. Absolutely terrifying. And, and then I know I've been focusing a lot on being critical of the left here, but I'm going to go back to that real quick. Because as we see all of these terrible rights violations, as we see the terrible behavior of Putin against his own people, it's all unfolding right in front of us. You'll have some people make arguments, trying to draw this false equivalency between the United States and Russia in how these two governments treat their people. Now, I'm very critical of the US government for multiple reasons. Mm-hmm. But to draw this false equivalency is pretty infuriating, right? Because while some people might bitch and moan about, Twitter or Twitch, whatever, mm-hmm. either demonetizing them or taking a video down, those are things that are worth getting mad about. Don't get me wrong. But to compare demonetized videos to what's happening in Russia, where people are being rounded up and threatened with 15 years prison time for calling it an invasion rather than a military operation, how do you even compare the two? It's a joke.
I mean, at least in the United States, you could call the Iraq War a war without getting arrested. And the proportionality, I think, is something that's difficult for a lot of people in America to wrap their head around. Because it seems as if almost every protester who's showing up to protest is being arrested, with some rare exceptions of exceptionally large gatherings. But the protesters in Russia know that if they are marked by police as a likely protester, they're going to be arrested if they leave their house with a sign, Yeah.
Yeah.
Which is, I mean, there are plenty of things to criticize the United States about. There are plenty of things to criticize U.S. police about. I talk about them all the time, but it's not that level. It's just not.
Yeah, and I think people who do that, who try to draw those false equivalencies, some people might, as you say, have difficulty understanding the differences, but I think that there are, and I don't understand what's behind it. Maybe they're just trying to be contrarian. Maybe they just want to provide commentary that's unique. Who knows? But it seems as though they're just trying to minimize the brutality of Putin. They're trying to deflect. It's the whataboutism that isn't helpful. And I think, if you want to bring up other similar issues to draw comparisons and to have a more robust conversation, that's totally fine. But the way that it's done, the context almost always ends up being, let's not really give a shit about this because, look at the United States. It reminds me of when Bill O'Reilly was interviewing Donald Trump and talked about Putin, called him a killer or something, if I remember correctly. And Trump was like, well, what about the U.S.? The U.S. kills a lot of people. And it was very clearly an effort to make it seem like what Putin does is no big deal. Right.
Yeah, I wanted to go back to something you said earlier, because this is also something I've heard from a lot of contrarian lefties about NATO being a threat to Russia. Can you expand a little bit on what you meant by that? because I'm getting a lot of different viewpoints on that. And it seems to me that, if anything, this invasion has kind of justified why nations in Europe want to be part of NATO, or has at the very least spurred a lot more nations in Europe to want to become part of NATO.
Yeah, so, well, let me address that last part real quick, because that's definitely legitimate. What Putin has essentially done with this miscalculated war is he has bolstered the support for NATO. He has strengthened the idea that NATO is an alliance that's incredibly important to keep countries safe, right? And so what he did was super counterproductive. With that said, though, I do agree that, and let me just reiterate, I don't think that Putin actually invaded Ukraine over NATO. I don't believe that. Okay, so let's put that aside. Mm-hmm. However, is it legitimate for Russia to see NATO as a security threat? Yes. Because among NATO countries that are closer to Russia, we've sent all sorts of military weaponry. We have military bases. We have missiles that we, claim, are not going to be used against Russia, but they could very easily be pointed toward Russia. We could totally use them against Russia. So my point is, try to think about it in the context of the United States. If, let's say, Russia and China and, I don't know, North Korea join as part of a security pact, mm-hmm. and they start pointing missiles at the United States or toward, European countries, EU countries, how would we feel about that? Would we see that as a provocation? Would we see that as a security risk? Mm-hmm. And so that's why I do agree that NATO in some ways makes the world less safe through some of the actions it's taken. Mm-hmm. So yeah, that's where I stand on that issue.
Yeah, I can definitely see that. I mean, when we're talking about geopolitics, nobody's a good actor,
right.
There's that saying, if you want heroes and villains, read a fantasy novel.
Yeah,
because every state has skeletons in its closet. Every geopolitical scale organization is going to be, not lily white and innocent,
Yeah. Well, can I actually, I want to bring up a very specific issue that I think helps paint a picture, helps people understand what I think you're trying to get at.
Yeah.
So for me personally, this war is devastating because I have my own concerns about Armenia, right? Mm-hmm. And so recently someone, I don't remember who, but someone tweeted me a photo of Armenians who were going to go to fight the war on behalf of Russia, mm-hmm. which I'm not happy about, obviously. But you have to understand why, okay? Armenia is this tiny country that has been brutalized by its neighbors, okay? Certainly its history with Turkey has been bloody. They underwent a genocide. And then one of their other neighbors, Azerbaijan, has been brutal as well. And they continue to essentially threaten the sovereignty of Armenia. They've invaded the borders of Armenia. I'm not talking about Nagorno-Karabakh. I know that's disputed territory, but the borders of Armenia, nationally recognized. And the only thing, literally the only thing protecting this small and pretty much defenseless country is Russia.
Right.
So with Russia now getting hit with these sanctions, with its military being incredibly weak, with all of this stuff going on, that puts Armenia in a terrible, terrible position. It is now essentially defenseless. So I understand why Armenians would side with Russians. They have their own security concerns in mind. For me, it complicates things because you have to look at what's in front of you. And what Russia has done is beyond devastating. It's committing war crimes. And I can't be blinded by my own concerns for Armenia in an effort to essentially cover up what Russia's doing. You have to be fair. You have to have integrity when you're sharing the news, and you have to be honest with your audience. And that's what I'm trying to do. However, the situation is way more complicated than I think most people think. And so when you have all these armchair generals weighing in, it's kind of frustrating.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the aspects that bothers me the most is that geopolitics is not simple. It's never simple. It is incredibly complicated and complex, and often is drawing upon like centuries of history that someone might not be aware of if they're just like a lay person trying to get an understanding of the situation, which I think is part of why a lot of people don't want to think about geopolitics that much. I mean, to be
Yeah.
fair.
Yeah.
And
Can I
when
just say,
oh yeah,
oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
I was just going to say that like I think this is something that applies to like the idea in America, where there were two polls that came out recently. One being like, Americans, are you in favor of a no-fly zone over Ukraine? And the majority of people said yes, around 60%. And then there was a follow-up, which Americans, are you in favor of a no-fly zone if it escalates tensions with Russia? And the majority of people said no. And it's just kind of this very simple level of understanding, and to an extent, like U.S. media is, I think, a little bit complicit for dumbing down the issue.
Totally. I mean, look, there are days when I get really irritated with media, and then I try to take a step back and look at what we've experienced personally with these types of stories. They don't typically do well.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And when there is a lot of pressure to make profit off of the news, producers, editors, whatever, they run away from things that don't perform well, that lower circulation or have less views. You have to balance it. And the way that we balance it at TYT, at least for the main show, I can't speak for all the other shows, is look, to me, doing these labor stories is really important. It's going to get 20,000 views. So I will agree to doing another video about Marjorie Taylor Greene because that's going to get hundreds of thousands of views. You get what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
So we found a business model that works. It's kind of painful, to be honest, because there are a lot of stories that we end up doing that I just don't have much to like. We did a Alex Jones video the other day, and Jenk sent it to me, and I was like, please don't make me. And he doesn't make me do anything. I can say no, I can reject it. And he's like, look, you can do it if you want. You can toss it to the side if you want, but I have a feeling this is going to perform really well. And he was right. That day, that video was our most viewed video. Mm-hmm. But the way that I think about it is, at least I get to share the stories that I really, really care about with my audience without feeling guilty that it didn't bring in any money,
Right. Yeah, exactly. Like it is genuinely important to cover like the Minneapolis teachers strike, one of the largest labor actions going on in the United States right now. And it is definitely hard to make those trade-offs in like a capitalistic economy for journalists. I'm sure at every outlet, though some outlets better than others, obviously.
Yep.
Because I know we're running out of time here. I did want to ask you, because this is an issue that is very polarizing in the United States. How do you see this like affecting the escalation of rhetoric that we're seeing, like all across the United States, from especially conservatives, when it comes to, frankly, this might sound hyperbolic to some people, but the growing threat of this fascist rhetoric in our country. Whether it's like the Don't Say Gay bill, or the ectopic pregnancy bill in Missouri, or a lot of conservatives are aligning themselves with Putin because they see Putin during his speeches saying a lot of the things that conservatives in America believe. Putin was talking about the other day about part of calling these people traitors to Russia was, they want their gender freedom.
Right. I saw that. Just absolutely disgusting. I highly, highly recommend that your viewers look into one of Putin's top advisors, this guy named Alexander Dugin, Dugin is his last name. And that guy's terrifying, but he is kind of representative. I think that ideology is something that appeals to people like Tucker Carlson. This idea of traditionalism. He considers himself a traditionalist. And they hate the idea of individual liberty, of having an identity that differs from nationalism, right? So seeing yourself as an individual who deserves all these rights. And so I don't want you to think about it in like materialist terms. This isn't about individualism versus collectivism. This is really about individual freedoms, individual identity. They want to do away with all of that. And I mean, they're just staunch nationalists. And I think that there is at least 35% of Americans fall in that camp. And they're incredibly well financed. They're very well organized. And that's why we're seeing what we're seeing in all of these red states across the country. It's terrifying. It really is. I lost it the other day talking about Idaho and its anti-abortion bill, and Missouri, where they're trying to pass legislation that prevents a woman from traveling out of state to get an abortion. Yeah. The Don't Say Gay bill. My sister-in-law, she happens to be gay. They have 2 kids, and her daughter is now getting bullied in school. Like, it's just a scary world that we're living in right now. And what makes it even worse is that we don't really have a party that is strong enough to effectively oppose it and like squash it. Right. Democrats are so incompetent, so impotent, so embarrassing. I don't know what the answer is, because the weakness that we see from Democrats only emboldens these, nationalists within our borders.
Right. So for the benefit of the audience, if any of you have heard the term Nazbol before, that is a reference to the ideology of Alexander Dugin. And it is basically a blending of Russian politics with Nazism. He's very open about that. And it is somewhat terrifying to me that and I don't think that you're incorrect about this, that a large portion of Americans would be down with that as long as it's associated with a different name that is unknown to them as being related to Nazis. It's terrifying, the weakness of the Democratic Party and the absolute failures under Joe Biden. I'm extremely worried about the elections this year, the midterms, and the what that could spell for 2024. Because Democrats fundamentally, and this is the issue, they do not want to give you anything. They do not want to give you any material benefits, and that is one of the issues that keeps them from offering any pushback to the rise of fascist ideology, because all they can say is no to ever escalating conservative demands that affect social lives. And they can't offer you any material benefits, and so they just continue getting weaker and weaker and weaker.
I know we got to wrap up soon. I could talk to you forever. I will make one more point because it's important. So, the anger among the electorate is real, whether they fall in the white nationalist camp or not. I think most Americans are furious at how much our government has abandoned us. And what I think is not going to play so well with both sides is the fact that, the spending bill that just got signed by Biden, it includes $13.6 billion in humanitarian and military aid for Ukraine, which I'm not necessarily against. I don't know all the details, like what exactly, what's the money really going to go to? I got to look into that. Yeah. But the idea of assisting Ukraine, I'm not necessarily against it. With that said, though, notably, the legislation, the spending bill, had nothing appropriated for the pandemic. And that means, as the White House has noted, they're going to run out of money for vaccines, boosters, monoclonal antibody treatments, testing. Basically, if there's another surge, we're not going to have the resources to deal with it. And by the way, if people are not going to get free vaccines or free boosters, they're not going to get boosted.
Exactly.
So the idea of, helping out another country and neglecting Americans is not going to play well for Democrats in the midterms or the general.
Yeah, I know you got to go. Just one quick follow-up to that is just that this is why private companies pour billions of dollars, and that was softened into the vaccine and treatments of various diseases. They are doing it not out of the goodness of their hearts, but so that they can wring money out of you after the government subsidies go away. And that has always been the plan with these treatments, with these vaccines. And it breaks my heart because this is capitalism, and people aren't going to know why they're getting hurt so badly when the hammer falls down.
Yeah. I totally agree.
Anyway,
all right.
Anna Casparian, executive producer and host of TYT, thank you so much for coming on. I could literally talk to you all day.
Me too. This went by so fast.
Yeah.
Thank you for having me, and I'd love to come back again if you'd have me.
Oh, absolutely. Anytime. Literally anytime.
Awesome.
You have a good day.
You too. Bye.
Bye.